In modern internet discussions, terms such as fighter, fighter bomber, interceptor, frontline fighter, and many others are used. Many times this classification can be confusing, however, they are necessary in order to understand each aircraft's development and particular use. As such, the lines between these categories are not always well defined and the boundaries can become blurred. There are some clearly visible trends in the development and evolution of fighters. This video series will attempt to explain the evolution of fighter jets and some of their main features and capabilities with focus on the years following the Second World War. Keep in mind that this is only an outline of a much longer and bigger story. Many additional videos will explain significantly with more detail on particular topics which are only shortly mentioned in the series. It is worth to start the story from the Second World War because it defined the design and application of the fighter planes in the early Cold War period, therefore its legacy lasted even to mid-50s. From the second part of the 50s, things started to change thanks to the powerful jet engines compared to the Second World War era piston and early jet engines. This made it possible to design and build airplanes with such size, weight and performance what were unimaginable even only a decade earlier. This and the Cold War environment led to quite specific development directions and resulted in different fighter categories. The landscape of the Cold War pushed design doctrines in a variety of directions, with some design features being in direct opposition to requirements of other design programs. The pinpoint accuracy is not the goal of the video, which is hardly achievable in such comprehensive topic. The point is presenting the overall trends to understand the evolution of fighter planes. The video shall help to understand the technical context of the main categories of the fighter planes and their primary and secondary roles. So, let's start first with perhaps the most popular, the fighter category. Although the name is synonymous with the task of shooting down enemy aircraft, essentially every Second World War fighter was able to attack ground targets with machine guns or autocannons built into their airframe. This basic ground attack feature is general from the simplest biplane types of the early war to the late war powerhouses like the Mustang or the Focke-Wulf 190. These could not threaten the harder targets like tanks, armored ships or concrete buildings. Against these, machine guns had limited or no effect at all. In addition to firearms, fighters of this era almost universally had the ability to carry small bomb loadouts, and some had provisions for firing unguided rockets such as the American P-47 and the P-51. However, the amount and weight of carried bombs was very modest compared to the real bombers. It was typically a pair of 100–250 kg under the wings or possibly 500 kg bomb under center line, or rarely a pair of 100 kg bombs under wings. The latter was considered extreme loadout even for a large P-47. Such a heavy and draggy loadout significantly reduced the performance and range of any fighter. The heaviest single-seat fighter at the time was the P-47, weighing less than 5 tons. The heaviest version of the German Messerschmitt 109 family, which served throughout the war, did not even reach 2.5 tons. When taking these numbers into account, it is much easier to comprehend how serious burden was even half-ton bomb for a single-engine World War II era fighter. By comparison, the B-26 Marauder medium bomber could carry 2.5 tons bomb load in bomb bays, but this feature required a nearly 11 tons airframe and multiple engines. From the two bomb bays, in the forward carried 2 900 kg or 4 500 kg bombs or 6 270 kg bombs. In addition, the rear bay could hold 2 122 kg bombs. Regardless bombers carried the weapons in bomb bays, they did not reach the top speed of fighters, even bombs did not increase the cross-section and drag of the planes. Fighters probably would not have been able to take off with a bomb of similar mass if they had been carried at all. It would have made the planes essentially unusable with such an extra load. Regardless a fighter was used in attack role, its firepower and range were nowhere comparable to any bomber. Some fighters had specialized variant for ground attack role like the Focke-Wulf 190, but the relation in firepower and range was just the same compared to the bombers. If these fighters participated in attack-type sorties using today's terminology, they were not yet identical at any level to even the smallest medium bomber. These were, for example, the American B-26, the German Henkel 111, Soviet PA-2 or the English Mosquito. The Soviet Ilyushin-2 Shturmovik was a specialized single-roll ground attack plane similarly to the Hawker Typhoon, regardless their general appearance is different. The Typhoon originally was designed to be a fighter plane, but for that purpose its performance was insufficient, so it was used in attack role with some modifications. Therefore, in World War II, for the single-engine fighter category meant that a fighter was typically able to attack ground targets, but their range and firepower was a very different category compared to a real bomber. The ability to carry a bomb did not make it a bomber, any of them. While some fighters lacked the bomb-carrying capability like the Spitfire Mk1, 2, 6, 14 as well as the Soviet Yak-1 and Yak-3. As the jet era dawned and the Cold War began, the doctrines of fighter design initially slowly changed. The same design requirements that dictated the single-engine types of World War II propagated into the first generation of jet fighters. The first of them did not have even swept wings like the F-84 Thunderjet. Unguided rockets, bombs, machine guns or autocannons were still the basic tools of fighters like the North American F-86 Sabre and the F-100 Super Sabre. The only difference was that a bomb could be a nuclear one. For example, the F-100 was capable of carrying a tactical nuclear bomb with quite an insane loadout asymmetry. The same can be said about the fighters in the Eastern Bloc. A MiG-15 or a MiG-21 were capable to perform ground attack sorties. But they lagged behind planes developed solely for this purpose in firepower and range, as the fighters were fundamentally smaller and lighter. Carrying large and heavy bombs greatly diminished their range and top speed. The average bombers of this era were, for example, the American B-54 Tornado or the Soviet Ilyushin-28. Interestingly, these were not swept-wing design planes, while the post-Second World War era jet fighters mostly got this new feature from the late 40s. This is quite strange considering that the time of the maiden flight of the F-86 Sabre and the B-54 is practically the same. Anyway, the F-100 is a striking example of the insane pace of the development in the aviation. Thanks to the incredible power of jet engines and the new aerodynamic design, it was twice as fast as the P-51 Mustang. This was despite the fact that it was barely 1 ton lighter than the World War II era B-61 bomber, which also means it was 3 times heavier than the Mustang. The Super Sabre could even carry a 2-ton bomb load, although it was not advisable to do so. At the same time, following World War II, as fighter planes became heavier, so did the bombers, whose payload and speed also increased. Therefore, with the exception of intercontinental bombers, the difference in useful weapon load between dedicated bombers and fighters roughly was the same in ratio. In case of the jet engines, it is necessary to point out that there were a major change in their development and application in the early 50s. At the end of World War II and the early 50s, we can find advanced fighter planes equipped with centrifugal or axial jet engines. These two designs differed in direction of airflow immediately following the compressor stage. In case of the axial flow engine, the air moves in roughly the same direction along the longitudinal axis of the engine, while in case of the centrifugal compression turbine, there is a nearly perpendicular direction in the flow. With the advent of supersonic era, the axial design became dominant because only with this design was supersonic speed is achievable. As an interesting side note, the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had this axial flow engine design, further proving just how ahead of its time the design really was. Despite its higher performance, the MiG-15 received a centrifugal jet engine that was typical only in the short period following the Second World War. Interestingly, the Soviet jet engine was a copy of an English design, the Rolls-Royce Nene. The decision of the British Labour government in 1946 to sell a small quantity of such engines to the Soviet proved incredibly foolish. Only a few years later, Western aircraft had to fight against jets using copies of this engine in Korea. However, centrifugal jet engines did not become extinct, they remained in use of various aircraft types. Instead of fighter jets, they were used on helicopters and subsonic cargo or utility planes with turboprop engines. Another important feature of the axial jet engines at the time, they were zero bypass engines. The total amount of air passed through every compressor and turbine stages. These were the turbojet engines. Fighter planes still were designed primarily to perform their main role. The strike capability was only a secondary thing. We can say it, many times it was just a theoretical thing. While it was not a rare transition, when a fighter plane became obsolete, from that point it was used only in attack role without any conversion or upgrade. As a result, the accuracy of air-to-ground weapons delivery was typically lower than the dedicated strike planes had in the same era. These converted fighters had smaller firepower except if we consider nuclear bomb as a tool of strike. Some planes got a second chance like the F-104 Starfighter. In the 50s was designed for only fighter role, but in the US was an unsuccessful plane. While for the European NATO countries and some other US allied states with some upgrades it was sold as a fighter/attack plane, the F-104G variant. No matter the upgrades and changes on the F-104, compared to dedicated strike role plane, the loadout of a starfighter was much smaller. In the Warsaw Pact, the MiG-15s and 70s were allocated to the attack role in almost all member states following the introduction of the MiG-21. This downgrade process was not a rare thing, in fact it was the usual thing during the whole Cold War. In the Israeli Air Force, the outdated Bister fighter from the 50s flew in the Six-Day War in 1967, but only in strike role. Following it was replaced by the Supersonic Mirage-3 fighters. The F-4 Phantom II was the new and best fighter in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. However, only 9 years later, the new F-15 and F-16 fighters replaced the Phantom, which served from that point only in various strike roles. In the 50s, the performance of fighter jets increased rapidly. The early 50s types were still subsonic like the F-86 or the MiG-15, but they already had maximum speed close to the speed of sound, reaching Mach 0.9. By the middle of the decade, fighters faster than speed of sound were produced in great numbers, but they did not reach the Mach 2 speed zone. These included the Soviet MiG-17, MiG-19 and the already mentioned F-100 Super Sabre, as was the French Super Mystère. The fighters of the 50s, as opposed to the types of 40s, were all swept-winged, typically with delta or trapezoid wing design. The afterburner stage started to appear on turbojet engines, but the increase in thrust initially was modest. I mean, it was only about 30% compared to the maximum military thrust. Later, from some engine types, the thrust boost by the afterburner reached even the 50–70% region. Of course, it also came at price. The fuel consumption could increase up to 5–10 times using the maximum afterburner power. These high-performance engines with afterburners brought the era of Mach 2 plus capable fighter planes. These planes were like the Soviet MiG-21, the American 104 Starfighter, the French Mirage-3 or the Sweden Draken, among many others. Despite the huge increase in weight and flight performance, fighter jets have not developed as much in other eras. With a little exaggeration, with a good approximation, it can be said that most of the fighters in the early and late 50s were about the same level regarding the instrumentation as piston engine fighters at the end of the Second World War. The image about a cockpit of the F-100 Super Sabre provides quite a good view. For comparison, here is the P-47 Thunderbolt's cabin as a benchmark. We hardly can find major difference between them. There was no dramatic improvement in finding enemy targets either. Even in the late 50s, it wasn't common for a fighter jet to be equipped with radar. Even if a fighter had radar, searching and finding targets without ground radar support provided very low chance for success. With the help of ground-based radars, the fighters were vectored near the targets using radio. The radar on any plane aided only maneuvering in terminal phase and served for nighttime engagement against bombers. The radars many times had so limited detection range against fighters that pilots simply neglected it. For example, Israeli pilots mostly never used the radar on Mirage-3 fighters because many times it only detected the target once they had spotted them with the naked eye. Now it is time to have some words about navigation. Only the largest and most modern fighter jets had some sort of radio navigation and landing aid system or equipment that provided a direct connection to a ground-based automated guidance system. These were mostly homeland air defense fighters, which formed a separate category from the rest, which can be called classical fighter planes. Any other statement applies only to frontline fighters using the Soviet terminology and the latter category. These homeland air defense fighter planes will be covered in another video. Navigation on fighter jets still were typically done using the map, stopwatch and the artificial horizon. In the field of armaments, also had to wait a little bit more for the first sign of the revolution. Until the late 50s, on average, only firearms were used on fighters. Despite the higher performance and carrying capacity, the machine guns remained in use. The F-86 Sabre was armed with the same 50 cal Browning heavy machine guns as the World War II era P-74 and P-51 fighters. In the 50s, however, autocannons with 20mm or higher calibers were typically used. Some fighters went all the way up to extreme 37mm gun. The typical upper limit of autocannon calibers was 30mm. Guided air-to-air missiles appeared only in the second half of the 50s. The first of these were the infrared-controlled AIM-4 Falcon and the AIM-9B Sidewinder. These entered service in 1956. The first combat use of the latter occurred in September of 1958 when Taiwanese F-86 fighters downed Chinese MiG-70s. The first infrared missile in the Soviet Union was born by copying the AIM-9B. Two lucky incidents made it possible to get a look at the US-made missile. A separate video will also cover the types of missile control and the case itself. Over time, the previously mentioned supersonic and even subsonic fighters of the late 50s were upgraded to be capable of using first generation of guided air-to-air missiles, but this was not a general thing. With few exceptions, this upgrade meant only short-range infrared guided air-to-air missiles. The debut of radar-guided and beyond visual range capable missiles happened later because of the more difficult technical feasibility. From the early 60s, the world of fighter jets began to split, mainly because of their size, which had several positive and negative side effects. Americans typically built large and heavy airplanes for their own use. An iconic example is the twin-engine F-4 Phantom II. It was expensive corresponding to its size and weight, at least for the vast majority of the world. Even the F-100 Super Sabre was not in the featherweight category, but the Phantoms with approximately 14 tons empty weight was quite impressive. The Soviet frontline fighters of the era, the MiG-17-19 and the MiG-21 were not even 6 ton heavy, the French Mirage 3 was only in the 7 ton range. However, the existence of the F-4 did not mean that Americans did not manufacture smaller and lighter fighters, but not for their armed forces. The F-5A Freedom Fighter and its later version, the F-5E Tiger, made a successful career in some European NATO countries and the Third World. For those who found the F-4 Phantom too expensive, the less than 5 tons fighter was a very affordable alternative. Of course, taking note the capability difference between the very small and very large twin-engine F-4. Regardless, the F-5 also was a twin-engine plane that turbojets paled in comparison in power compared to the G-76 of the Phantom. In NATO, Norway, the Netherlands and Turkey used them in greater numbers, but the F-5 was more successful in the third world countries than in Europe. Also was in the cheaper category the F-104 Starfighter, which weighed less than 7 tons. Despite the iconic look of the fighter, it was essentially a footnote in the United States. European NATO countries acquired much more from this fighter than the US. West Germany alone bought or manufactured more than 900 TIE fighters, but Italy and Canada have also acquired hundreds of them. To put into perspective the prices and the scale between the F-4 and the smaller fighters, here are some figures. Following the acquisition of the F-104G, the Federal Republic of Germany also purchased the F-4 Phantom, but only 175 combat and 88 reconnaissance RF-4 variants. As a reminder, during the Second World War, the single-engine piston-engine powered fighters were typically in the 2–3.5 tons weight region. Even the twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 stopped at 4.2 tons. The American P-38 also had a weight of only 5.5 tons. What was considered large and heavy during Second World War, it became the featherweight category by the 1960s. Such a revolution was the advent of the gas turbine and its rapid development. Until the 1960s, most fighter jets were also able to attack ground targets with bombs or unguided rockets. There was a difference in flight performance, range and size between the smaller fighters and the dedicated strike airplanes. It is enough to look on the MiG-21 and the Su-7. On the American side, the same is true if we compare, for example, the 104 fighter with the 105 fighter bomber, or if we check the differences between the F-4 Phantom fighter and the F-111 fighter bomber in the late 60s. In both cases, the strike planes were larger and heavier, but they were supersonic planes. Moreover, the F-111 could fly faster than twice of the speed of sound without weapons. Supersonic capable strike aircraft thus essentially represented a new category. These were the fighter bombers. There will be a separate video on these as well. However, in the early 60s, a new fighter jet appeared in America which at least partially revolutionized the military aviation and paved the way for the future. This was the previously mentioned F-4 Phantom. It was the first fighter with beyond vision range air capability thanks to the AIM-7 Sparrow missile. The huge size of the plane also made it possible to integrate the electronics needed for the daytime good weather strike role. Moreover, it made it possible to carry such a weight of bombs which was almost identical to the dedicated strike types, but this was a trade-off in terms of range. The Phantom was capable of carrying 12 or even 18 500-pound or 3 2,000-pound bombs. Until then, this feature was an exclusive thing for dedicated strike planes like the F-104 in the Air Force or the A-6 Intruder in the US Navy. In addition, the F-4 was able to do in such a way that besides the bomb load, the full air-to-air armament still could be carried. Of course, loaded with lots of bombs and heavy missiles, its range was smaller than the other two mentioned dedicated strike planes, because bombs were carried instead of drop tanks below the fuselage or at the outer wing hardpoints. However, the fact that the Phantom could be used with such extreme configurations was quite astonishing from the point of view of the early 60s. The single airplane could be used as a top-tier fighter, but it could even be a bomb track in case of need within certain limits. However, this kind of multi-role capability of the F-4 Phantom did not mean that it was on par in every area and features with the best fighter bombers or even some dedicated subsonic strike planes. The weight and amount of the strike armament is not everything. The range and accuracy which defines the delivery also are very important. The A-6 Intruder or the F-111 strike planes were able to use terrain following and terrain mapping capable radars to approach the target at low altitudes and then bomb it, even at night. The Phantom lacked these features. It had only good weather daytime strike capability. So, when anybody says that F-4 is just another new fighter, it would be quite an understatement compared to any fighter planes before, because it was much more an all-around plane. But let's look at the other side of the coin to understand what the multi-role fighter label means, which can be attributed to the F-4 Phantom. Dedicated strike planes had almost no air combat capability, which they had. It was close to being symbolic. Although the F-111 or A-7 Corsair could carry the AIM-9 Sidewinder short-range air-to-air infrared guided missile, this did not make them multi-role. The Sidewinder could be used at best for self-defense, but that was so theoretical that most of the time they were even carried. Overall, the Phantom is far more versatile, but in the field of firepower and combat radius, the F-111 or the A-7 Corsair were better. That's why the F-4 Phantom is essentially the first true multi-role fighter. It had the best air-to-air capability that a fighter could have at the time, while it was the first which has really comparable in enough features with dedicated strike planes like the F-104 Thunderchief. The multi-role label many times is simply neglected for convenience. However, the standard of being multi-role was differently interpreted in the late 60s era than from the 90s, just keep in mind until we arrive there in the story. This capability constraint is also true backwards. The F-104 Thunderchief was not a fighter, despite its type designation, but it was a fighter bomber regardless its fighter-like appearance. Over Vietnam, pilots achieved 30 air victories with them, 95% with guns and the rest with air-to-air missiles. Despite the success of the F-104 in some of the air combats, it didn't mean that it matched its versatility with the F-4 Phantom in air combat. The air victories of the Thundershift planes were not in the "we want it this way" category. They essentially had to fight with the MiGs because of the unfortunate circumstances. The planes were not tasked on fighter mission, they did not seek the opportunity to fight with the MiGs. In the Soviet Union, the separation of the main roles remained in the 60s and even later. The first Soviet frontline with beyond visual range air combat capability was the MiG-23 family. It was fielded roughly 10 years later than the F-4 Phantom, but it was designed with an innovative solution of the mid-late 60s with variable sweep wing. Thanks to this new approach, its range, acceleration and top speed met the top-tier category of Mach 2 speed-capable fighters, while at the same time it has reasonable landing speed. In some areas even surpassed the F-4 Phantom. Due to its variable sweep wing, the small cross-section and the powerful turbojet engine, its horizontal acceleration was astonishing in high subsonic and supersonic regions. However, due to the narrow fuselage and the lack of swiveling hardpoints, the MiG-23 had a very limited number of weapon stations compared with the F-4. While the MiG was only 15% lighter than the F-4, its air-to-air armament was only 4 and later only 6 missiles. Only 2 could be the beyond visual range capable R-23 Air. 3 drop tanks could be carried but only up to roughly M05 speed with minimal wing sweep settings because of lack of swiveling hardpoints on wings. Only the center line drop tank could be carried without limiting the wing sweep angle. For comparison, the F-4 Phantom could carry 2 370 US gallon drop tanks under outer wing station and 1 600 US gallon center line drop tank. At the same time, the Phantom could carry the maximal air-to-air armament, the 4 Sparrow and 4 Sidewinder missiles. The strike capability of the MiG-23 remained almost at the level of the fighter jet of 50s. It could carry a slightly heavier armament, but only on the same weapon station as air-to-air missiles. So, for any air-to-ground firepower, at least a part of air-to-air firepower had to be sacrificed. The quantitative relation compared to the fighter bombers was almost the same as was in World War II between the P-71 and B-26. The maximal 4 500 kg bomb payload was not a big feat for an 11-ton heavy fighter. It was a big step forward for the MiG-23 that it could use the Kh-23 guided air-to-ground missile, but this was not typical. It was not widely used in the proxy Cold War conflicts. The Kh-24 missile was similar to the American AGM-12 bullpup. Anyway, some versions of the 50s F-100 fighter were converted to be able to use it. Of course, the F-4 Phantom also could employ the bullpup. Therefore, this new feature of the MiG-23 was appreciated, but it should not be considered as a unique capability in the early 70s. Anyway, the types of controls of different strike weapons will be covered in the separate video series. A specialized sub-variant of the MiG-23, the MiG-23BN, and following a much extensive redesign, the MiG-27 was created. For this reason, in my opinion, the MiG-23 cannot be considered as a multirole fighter. Because if it was a multirole plane, the specialized variant would not exist. The versatility of the MiG-24 fighter versions thus lagged behind the F-4 Phantom. But from a Soviet point of view, even this new frontline fighter was a still big leap forward in range, flight performance and firepower compared to the MiG-21 family. Among the Western European fighters, the French Mirage F1 and the Swedish Viggen were better known and produced in greater numbers. About these, we can say the same as for the MiG-23, they had specialized strike and reconnaissance variants. The strike capability of planes which were designed for fighter roles was symbolic or non-existent. These models already had beyond visual range air combat capability, but they also did not achieve the versatility that the F-4 Phantom. So, essentially, the fighter term in case of these planes regarding the base variant really cover only single role planes. While the F-4 airframe could be used in fighter role, it had real firepower and range with air-to-ground weapons. This could not be said about other planes in the 60s or even the early 70s. In my opinion, we cannot speak about multirole fighters when two main different versions existed using the base platform. For example, the JA-37 Viggen was the single-role fighter variant and the strike version was the AJ-37. This was just the same relation as between the MiG-23 and the MiG-23BN and MiG-27 pairs. Even in the mid-late 60s and early 70s, fighter jets still had similar cockpit to World War II planes. Even in the mid-late 60s and early 70s, fighter jets still had similar cockpit to World War II planes. In the pit, more and more switches and analog instruments were installed, which made worse the overcrowding issues. It became necessary to use such a large number of switches and instruments that there were often these on both sides of the cockpit. Because of this, the view from the cabin was poor on many planes, which was a serious matter in maneuvering air combat. We can say they were the XXL versions of Second World War era cockpits. This was due to the fact that the planes had more and more subsystems, but the way they were displayed and handled remained essentially unchanged. The only screen display in the cabin was mostly only the radar image display. This meant a cathode ray tube screen at the time, which size many times was constrained by the lack of free space. In addition, on more advanced planes, the radar warning receiver display could also get a CRT display, but in the 60s these were present literally only on US-made planes. The electromechanical instruments were more functionally grouped for some fighters which needed a large enough cockpit. Vertical trip instruments appeared on some fighter types, which made the flying easier in some cases, but nothing other serious happened in general. For smaller fighters, navigation happened with the triumvirate of the map, stopwatch and artificial horizon. Only the largest and advanced fighters such as the F-4 Phantom had inertial navigation system. Smaller, less advanced and less expensive planes mostly had only radio beacon tracker navigational aid. The built-in navigation computer with linked autopilot navigational modes was typical for only very large planes or late versions of the smaller fighters. A good example of the latter is the G variant of the F-104 Starfighter. This version was exported to European states, which got an inertial navigation system. The capability of the radars did not make possible the reliable target search without receiving information from ground or sea-based long-range search radars against high-speed targets due to their modest detection range and slow scan speed. The other serious issue was that the radars were unable to detect targets flying lower in ground clutter with a large altitude difference. With a modest altitude difference, it was possible to detect and track a target if the planes were flying at least a few kilometers high. Overall, in short, when someone talked about a fighter jet in the 60s, it covered only a single role plane, and only the F-4 Phantom was an exception from this rule of thumb. Only with the F-4 was it possible to perform fighter and good weather daytime strike missions with massive firepower. There was much smaller difference in capability between the dedicated strike planes and the F-4 compared to any other fighter in the world. However, a new era started in America in the 70s, but that will be a story for another time. If you like the video, share, subscribe, ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support the channel via Patreon for exchange early access videos, voting on planned topics, and extra content is accessible as well as regular updates about the projects.